So in today's video, guys, we're going to be talking really brief, and I mean really brief, about the American Revolution. Why did it happen? What is revolution? And then I'm going to be taking you to another revolution that happened not too far. This stuff took place in 1765. I want to take you to the 1970s and talk about a revolution that was led by young kids just like yourself. But let's talk really quick about the American Revolution, because I really want to make this connection. And so the American Revolution was a colonial revolt. Remember the 13 colonies, which occurred between 1765 and 1783. It was the American patriots in the 13 colonies defeated the British in the American Revolutionary War with the assistance of France, winning independence from Great Britain. And so, again, they were, taxation without representation. They needed to do something to stop the British from doing what they were doing. They were in a situation and they needed a revolution. Well, let's look up the term, let's do it right here. What is the definition? The definition of revolution. What is the definition of revolution? And so, this is what it says. It's a forcible overthrow of a government or a social order in favor of a new system. Okay? The second one says, I won't read the second one, but here it is. The definition of a revolution is the movement of one object around the center of another object. That's talking about revolving. That's not what we want to talk about. So we're going live. So I'm just speaking. So a revolution is to rise up, to change something. And what I want to talk to you about is another revolution that is dear to my heart because I lived through this revolution. And it is a revolution that began in the 1970s in a very poor section of New York City that is called the Bronx. And primarily in this area of the Bronx called the South Bronx. And in this area were a lot of people who were living, white people, a lot of Jewish people, white people were living in these areas. And what started to happen was Black and Hispanic families who were coming from Puerto Rico and from the Caribbean islands would come to and live in this area of the Bronx. And so what started to happen, what was known as white flight, and the people living there started to leave. And the landlords who owned the buildings began to, because people were leaving, they needed to be able to get some money, much like the taxation without representation. So they needed to get some money because all of their tenants were leaving. They were moving out because they did not want to live among Black and Hispanic people. And so what the landlords of the buildings would start to do is they would start to burn down the buildings. They would hire gang members who were in the area, and they would put gasoline on the buildings, on the roofs, and they would light a match and they would burn the buildings down. And that's why the South Bronx at one time became known as the burnt down Bronx. And so living in these conditions was bad for a lot of the families that could not leave. They couldn't afford to go and live somewhere else. It was known as one of the poorest sections in America at this time. But out of the ashes of that burnt down rubble, that burnt down building, that burnt down courtyard, were these children, were these kids, urban kids, who back then would, go out and would invent games, and, there was no really video games at that time. So they would go and they would have to be outside all the time. That's not just true of the South Bronx at that time. That's true of most people in the 1970s. They were outside all the time, playing. And I was a little kid at that time, and I was in that area. And what I started to notice was a revolution, a change that needed to happen, because a lot of these urban kids were frustrated. They were upset that they had to live in these conditions with no hope of ever getting out of those conditions. And so they started to create a subculture within that culture. And the first thing that we started to notice was music. And so DJs would bring their DJ equipment, the two turntables, outside to create an atmosphere of hope. And they would play music for the neighborhood. In the midst of all of this chaos, just like the revolution, these kids started to fight back in a different way. They were determined to change the way they were living by creating hope. And so DJing started, and then these people called writers or graffiti writers wanted to make the neighborhood look a little bit better. Now, this is not true of all the graffiti writers, because graffiti is really just, the definition of graffiti is writing something on a wall. And so some of it wasn't really beautiful. They just wanted to write their name. But they were in such a hopeless condition that they wanted to write their name everywhere so that people would know who they are, because otherwise nobody would know who they are because of where they lived. Nobody was going there to see them. So they put their name on walls so people could know who they are. And they didn't use their real name. They used an alias. They used another name. And I used to do that as well. I used to what was called bomb or tag. And I would write my name on the walls. And then there came, so we have the DJ, we have the graffiti writer, and these are young kids in these areas who are saying, we have to do something to change the way we're living. And I want you to keep in mind, though, graffiti was illegal. It still is illegal to write on somebody else's property. But they were so they were so desperate for change. And then eventually what started to happen is they wanted to beautify the community. So now they start doing these big, beautiful murals with beautiful colors. And then the dance comes. And these young kids invent and create this dance known as b-boying or break dancing. They would break down onto the floor during a certain section of the record that the DJ was playing. And so they created this dance, and they would, instead of, because back then the gangs were very heavy and they were fighting against each other. And so now they decided to change. They wanted a revolution, a positive revolution. So they started to dance against each other instead of fight each other. This doesn't mean that fighting stopped, but just certain people stopped doing it in favor of dancing now. And I'm going to give you a little bit of an example of each one of these elements in some of the videos. You're going to see attachments. So the dancers, and then the last aspect is the rappers, who became the voice of the city, the voice of hopelessness, to let people know this is how we're living. This is the conditions that we're living in. And so out of this bad condition, this revolution of hope comes, and it continues, and people thought it was a fad and it would never last, and it continues, and today it is $1 billion a year industry that is making many young kids and young people from the urban areas millionaires, even some billionaires. But it started with a revolt from kids who said, we need to change the way we're living. We want better. So we have to be creative and create something out of nothing. It was much different back then. They didn't have anything. They had to create it themselves. And that's much of the way I like to teach. I like you to create something out of nothing. Use your imagination. Use your tools to create. And that's what they had to do in this revolution in the 1970s. And so what I'm going to do, I'm going to show a couple of clips of a DJ. I'm going to show you the conditions of the South Bronx. I'm going to show you the graffiti writer. I'm going to show you the b-boy. And then I'm going to show you the rapper, the MC. And there'll be little short clips just talking about what each of these meant in this also American revolution, from urban kids in a part of America that was forgotten and left for dead. But out of the ashes came a movement that would be known as hip-hop culture, and that would totally help to reshape American history as we know it. All right, so watch some of these videos and get inspired with your assignment that you're going to have to do. I'll talk to you soon.